My name is Bernard Rudberg. I retired from IBM Engineering 16 years ago and got into trying to restore the train station, the old depot in Hopewell Junction. So, since we were going to restore the train station, we decided we ought to know what it should look like. So I started digging into the history of the local railroads, and out of that, I wound up writing a book about it.
What inspired you to write the book?
Well, what happened was that I discovered that the headquarters building of the railroad that ran across Dutchess County was in Matawan, which is now part of the city of Beacon. And a couple of years ago, there was a construction crew renovating the building. They were putting in a tanning salon and a few other things, apartments. And they discovered the original record books of the railroad up in the loft of the building. Well, the construction guys were smart enough to know what they had. So they donated those books to the Beacon Historical Society, which just happened to be right across the street. And that's where I found the books. There are 48 volumes of the original books, 11 by 17 ledger books, handwritten on onion skin paper. And there were 700 pages in each of the 48 volumes for a total of over 30,000 pages of everything that happened to the railroad from 1879 to 1904. Whose pig got run over they had to pay for, and the washroom sink is clogged up again, and everything that happened to the railroad over that 25-year span. So I put together a book called 25 Years on the NDC based on those record books. And that covered the period of time when the big bridge in Poughkeepsie was built, which had a rather drastic effect on the railroad. And that's the point here today. If we're talking about the big bridge in Poughkeepsie, what happened to that local railroad as a result of the construction of that bridge. If you have any questions, so.
Sure. Well, one thing I took from your book was that you see a lot of the personality of
Yes.
people coming through.
Yes.
Could you speak to some of the anecdotes and the way in which you see these personalities and what
yes.
life was like?
Yeah, by the time I spent almost a year reading all 30,000 pages of those original records, and by the time I got to the end of it, I felt like these people were old friends of mine. Charles Kimball was the supervisor. General Schultz was one of the owners of George Brown. When you're looking at the handwritten versions of these, if you could tell almost what was happening by the way it was written. If it was written in big script with an underline, he was ticked off about something that day, and frustrated or whatever, how to run a railroad and how to survive competing with the New York Central over a period of time, and how to make a small railroad business run. And there were lots of things that happened. That railroad started from Dutchess Junction, which is just south of Beacon along the Hudson River. That's where Pete Seeger lives nowadays, if you know Pete Seeger. Anyway, they started from that point and built a railroad diagonally across Dutchess County up through Fishkill, Brinkerhoff, Hopewell Junction, up through Millbrook and Pine Plains to Millerton. And it had 58 miles of track entirely within Dutchess County. Well, it started out as the Dutchess and Columbia Railroad, named for the two counties it was supposed to go through. And the thing is, George Brown leased the whole operation before it was finished building. The first revenue run in 1869, the name on the coaches was Boston, Hartford, and Erie. He leased the whole thing to the Boston, Hartford, and Erie. Now, the Boston, Hartford, and Erie was a big railroad coming from Boston across Connecticut into New York State, and their intentions were to build a deep water port on Dennings Point. If you're familiar with Dennings Point, just south of Beacon. They had all kinds of grand plans, and they had built a trestle across from the mainland over to the tip of Dennings Point. And the problem was, this was in 1869. In 1870, they went bankrupt, and it never got completed. So they had started building tracks from Hopewell Junction across towards Stormville in Connecticut, but they never got completed. So when it went bankrupt, George Brown heard about it, and about 2 o'clock in the morning, he and one of the engineers went down to the roundhouse at Dutchess Junction, fired up the old steam engine Washington, and went up along the line and posted guards at each of the stations along the line. And they got to Hopewell Junction, and they pulled up some of the rails that connected to the BH&E equipment that was out east of Hopewell, which trapped their equipment out there. And he basically took back the railroad, and it now went back to being the Dutchess and Columbia. They had some borrowed equipment, and they were back in business. Well, George Brown had much bigger ideas about what he wanted to do. So by 1872, this was only 2 years later, he had this grand scheme, and he formed what was known as the New York, Boston, and Northern Railroad. The idea was to string together a whole series of small railroads with some connecting links and make a line from New York City up into the northern part of New York State to compete with the New York Central along the Hudson River. Well, that lasted only 2 or 3 months, and he expanded it, and it became the New York, Boston, and Montreal. And then that was in 1873. And with the same intention, he was going to go up through Rutland, Vermont, to reach Montreal. This was a grand scheme, and they had construction going. They bought the right of way. They were building a lot of construction. But in the financial panic of 1873, they went bankrupt. So the New York, Boston, and Montreal was never completed. If you know where to look around places like Clove Valley, you can find stonework where the bridges were being built across. There's old pieces of the right-of-way out there in the woods that have just been laying there since 1873, over 130 years. Never was completed. So anyway, when that went bankrupt in 1873, George Brown pulled his horns in, and it became the Dutchess and Columbia again in Dutchess County. Of course, that only lasted another year till 1874, when the Dutchess and Columbia went bankrupt. Times were tough back then. Anyway, in 1874 it went into receivership, so it was under the directorship of the local courts. And in 1877, it operated 3 years under receivership. And in 1877, it was reorganized as the Newburgh, Dutchess, and Connecticut. So you can see he pulled his horns in. He wasn't going to go all the way to Montreal. He was just going to go from Newburgh to Connecticut, across Dutchess County. I guess he learned his lesson. But apparently, the name Newburgh on there, you say, well, how does a railroad get to Newburgh? Well, at Dutchess Junction, they had built a ferry service to haul train cars across the river. So the other end of the railroad was actually a barge ride to Newburgh. They had barges with railroad tracks on the deck, and they would just roll the cars out onto the barge, anchor them down, run them across the river with a steamboat called the Fanny Garner. This was in 1872, 73, 74, along in that time frame when it started. And by 1878, 79, along in that time frame, that was a going business, hauling tons and tons of Pennsylvania coal, mainly coal, across the river. And then we're distributing it all through New England, and Dutchess County, of course. But the problem was the length of time it took to get a train across the river. You had to roll the cars on. You couldn't roll the whole train onto the barge. You rolled a few cars on, open it up, run a few more cars on the track next to it. And it was a rather labor-intensive, slow operation to get a train across the river. It took a couple hours to get a train across the river. And in addition to that, the problem was in the winter when the river froze up, you couldn't get them across at all. Just when you needed the coal in the wintertime, you couldn't get it across the river. So people started looking at this and saying, well, we need a bridge. So it was during that time frame that they started planning and building the big bridge in Poughkeepsie. Well, meanwhile, the ND&C was hauling all this stuff, mainly coal and passengers, of course. But by the time the bridge was built, the big bridge in Poughkeepsie in 1888, the New York and New England Railroad had been formed. Now, this was the pieces of the old Boston, Hartford, and Erie that had been reorganized, and they were still trying to get to the Hudson River for that deep port. And they decided to build one. Instead of buying Denning's Point, they built Fishkill Landing. And that was in 1881 when the tracks came across from Connecticut. And to get to the Hudson River from Hopewell Junction, they leased the rights to run on the ND&C tracks from Hopewell Junction down to Beacon, which, well, at that time it was called Matawan. But the thing that now you had two railroads, the ND&C and the New York and New England, running trains, freight and passenger, in both directions on one single track, which was a nightmare for the people trying to keep track of it and keep them from running into each other. Of course, they did run into each other from occasions, but some of the effects of that, I've seen pictures of some of the wrecks that they had during that period of time, and there was always contention between the two railroads, but they had to live together because they both had to use the same set of tracks. So in 1881, they built much bigger facilities for traveling across the river. Now, the original one down at Dutchess Junction was the Fanny Garner, and I've got pictures of that. And later on, the new one that was built was Fishkill Landing. And this Fishkill Landing facility was much bigger, and it had a lot more room in the yard for freight cars, and it also had two ferry docks for ferrying cars across the river. And the main ferry that ran across the river at Fishkill Landing was called the William T. Hart. Now, the William T. Hart was actually named for one of the original, I guess he was the president of the New York and New England Railroad. But anyway, at the time it went into service across the river, it was the second largest ferry boat in the world. It was over 300 feet long, and it had two completely independent steam engines, one on the right side, one on the left, so that they could reverse one of them and turn it around in its own length. So it was it was the latest and greatest in 1881 when it went into service. And they could take 27 cars at a time across the river. So, it was still pretty slow because you had to load all the cars on. And this was in 1881. Now we're still getting closer and closer to the building of the big bridge in Poughkeepsie. Now, the ND&C Railroad was still running, hauling coal, and the New York and New England was also hauling coal. And at that point, it's in the 1880s, coal was the big thing. Everybody ran on coal. Nobody had an oil burner because they hadn't dug oil out of Pennsylvania yet at that point, at least not enough of it to do any good. So and also some of the coal came across from Pennsylvania through the canal to Rondout in Kingston in barges through the canal. And from there, it came down the river to Dutchess Junction, and they would load it onto train cars and distribute it. But it still depended on the river, and when it iced over, you got a problem. So I guess when they finally did build the big railroad bridge, it opened. The first train across it was in December of 1888. But the problem was there weren't any tracks on the west end of the bridge. Tracks didn't go anywhere. So the train ran over to Highland and came back again. That was as far as it could go. And it took a good 6 months after the bridge was built before they had tracks that ran from Highland on down to what they call Orange Junction, which later became Maybrook. Okay, now we got this big bridge, and you've got tracks going down to Orange Junction, and Orange Junction connected to the railroads on the other side of the river, on the west side of the river. Well, the thing that happened then was that you could run a train across that bridge even when there was ice on the river. You didn't have to worry about barges. So there was still competition, though, because the ND&C Railroad wanted to stay in business, and they were hauling coal, so they still kept using their barge traffic as long as they could, and it lasted until 1904. And the Fishkill Landing ferry service finally ended in 1904 when the New Haven Railroad bought it out and closed down the ferry service and ran all their freight service across the big bridge in Poughkeepsie. Well, meanwhile, the railroad that owned the bridge included some of the local railroads around Poughkeepsie area. Okay, there was a group there, and it was formed in 1899, formed the Central New England Railroad. Well, the Central New England Railroad was actually funded by New Haven Railroad money, and it operated like it was a division of the New Haven Railroad. So they, it wasn't until 1927 that it was finally absorbed formally into the New Haven Railroad. So the Central New England Railroad, or the New Haven actually behind it all, wanted to buy the big bridge. Well, the people who owned it decided that they didn't want to sell unless they took all the other railroads and things that went with it in a package deal. Well, the New Haven Railroad didn't want all these other little small railroads. All they wanted was the big bridge for their freight traffic. So when the C&E finally took over, one of the things that happened then was almost immediately after the C&E took over, the first thing they did was to start dismantling all the little small railroads, which included the ND&C and the Rhinebeck in Connecticut. That ran across the northern part of Dutchess County from Rhinebeck to Millerton. Anyway, the C&E didn't really want all these little small lines, so then he started a program of abandonment. So the town of Dutchess Junction, which I showed you a picture of a while ago, that was the first to go. In 1907, they closed down the operation of their locomotive repair shops, the roundhouse, and all that sort of thing, and sold all that stuff for scrap value or salvage value. So if you go down to Dutchess Junction today, there's nothing left but a few bricks. So this what was the town of Dutchess Junction along the river no longer exists because the big bridge in Poughkeepsie was built. That was in 1907 that they sold most of the equipment that had been down there that belonged to the ND&C Railroad, but they still kept the station there and the tracks still connected. And that lasted until 1916. In 1916, they finally closed down the line and the station at Dutchess Junction, and they tore out the bridge over Fishkill Creek and tore out the tracks, and they were sold for the scrap value in 1916 to support efforts in World War I. So now there was tracks from Beacon to Hopewell Junction and on up through Millbrook were still in place. But the C&E didn't want them, and they built up all their freight traffic across the big bridge, while meanwhile they were tearing out all the little lines. Well, the line from Millerton to Pine Plains and down through, by 1938, they had torn out all those tracks. And in 1938, most of those tracks and rails were sold for scrap to Japan. Well, you know what Japan did with them in 1941, so probably they're pieces of Dutchess County laying in the bottom of Pearl Harbor. That was Dutchess County's contribution to the war effort. But that was pretty much the end of what had been the ND&C. Now there's a piece of that track from Hopewell Junction down to Beacon is still in place, and it belonged to New Haven Railroad. And then some years later, when you got into the 1970s, it was glommed into the Penn Central, and the Penn Central inherited the big railroad bridge in Poughkeepsie. So then later on, that became Conrail, and then in 1974, the bridge caught fire and stopped all the traffic. So meanwhile, the major locomotives and things that ran across that bridge that belonged to the New Haven Railroad were a type called the New Haven L1 class. They were 210-2 Santa Fe type locomotives. They were fairly low speed, but they had enough horsepower to drag half the world along with them. When they were made for freight service, low speed freight service. And there were a number of them that were based in the Maybrook Yard and also at Hopewell Junction, and they traveled back and forth across that bridge in Poughkeepsie on a regular basis every day. And there's a picture I have. This picture was I got this picture from Bill Kimbark. The Kimbark family had 3 generations who worked for the railroad. I'm not sure exactly how they acquired this picture, but it shows one of those L1 locomotives and a line of freight cars going across the bridge. During the life of the bridge, when it was first built, it had 2 sets of stringers across. In other words, it was a dual kind of a bridge, and it had 2 tracks on the top. Well, when these heavier 210-2 locomotives came along in 1918, the locomotives were so much heavier and the freights were getting bigger and heavier that they discovered that the bridge was beginning to tilt when it went across. They said, this is not a good idea. So they strengthened the bridge during the time frame from about 1907 to 1910. They put a 3rd set of steel all through the center of the bridge. If you look at old pictures of the bridge, you can see the early pictures, there were 2 sets of steel, and later pictures, there were 3 sets of steel under the bridge. And the tracks on the top were converted to what they call, they were moved to the point where they were in the center rather than on 2 tracks on the sides. Okay, they were called a gauntlet. And they moved the tracks into the center, and but then the problem then was only 1 train at a time could use the bridge. Well, that wasn't too big a problem because they put signal towers on the ends and controlled the traffic. But with the weight in the center of the bridge, then it wouldn't tilt side to side anymore. And it remained that way until 1960 or 61, I think, when they single tracked it all the way through. The the bridge has a long history of all sorts of things. I've talked to some of the people who worked on the railroads. One of the fellows was an engineer, and he said he used to run across that bridge quite often. And one particular fireman, well, this was on a diesel engine, even though still had firemen on a diesel engine because they had to have two people. And he said this fireman was totally afraid of heights. He didn't like that bridge. So every time they got to the bridge, he would hide underneath the console until they got across the other side of the bridge. He wouldn't even look out the windows. So, but it's 212 feet from the tracks down to the water. So it's a spectacular view from up there on the bridge. And one of the older stories I've heard is about one of these 210-2 locomotives had a problem on the bridge. One of the tires on the drive wheel, steam locomotives had steel tires on their drive wheels that could come off for maintenance. Well, one of those tires came off and was clanging around on the rods and stopped the train in the middle of the bridge. So now what do? You've got this locomotive and a bunch of freight cars out there on the bridge, and this is in winter weather. How do you get a tire back onto onto a locomotive out in the middle of the bridge? Well, the maintenance crews did it. They brought the equipment out there and jacked it up and heated the tire to expand it, put it back on, and did the whole job out there, 200 and some feet over the river. And they said, of course, one of the things that they discovered that some of the guys had hip flasks in their pockets while they were doing the job. Otherwise, they wouldn't have walked out on the bridge. But there are things like that you really wonder, about the people who did that sort of thing and what kind of a life it was. I've talked to some of the people who used to run across that bridge. Tony Morano, who was one of the members of the Maybrook Museum today. If you go over there, you can find Tony usually on weekends. He's quite an interesting character to talk to. He'll talk to you all day about riding that caboose and all the things that happened, in riding that caboose. And the things that were happening, a lot of times there would be problems with the wheels on freight cars, and you would have sparks and that type of thing. So fires were a regular problem on that bridge. They happened periodically. And there were water lines and sand barrels all across the bridge. And when they noticed a problem, a fire of some sort, and they also had patrols walking across the bridge to make sure that there weren't anything burning out there. Well, a number of those fires were put out by the local train crews. And Tony talks about putting in money to replace the shoes that got ruined when he's out there, trying to put out a fire on the bridge and that type of thing. And the sand barrels and all, and there was a watchman crew, and they had a regular watchman, with the key that turns in the watchman's lock out there on the bridge, so that they knew he was out there patrolling back and forth on the bridge, particularly during World War II, when it was really an important, for hauling a lot of military stuff. Well, so it was a known fact that the bridge was very prone to having small fires. And when Conrail operated the bridge, and the amount of traffic across that bridge was slowly dwindling down, and the Maybrook Yard over in Maybrook was slowly getting smaller and smaller volumes of traffic, Conrail decided that basically they didn't need that bridge. They didn't, and there's all sorts of conspiracy theories about what happened to the bridge, but basically they didn't fill up the sand barrels anymore, and they let the water pipes on the bridge freeze, so that they broke, and so they were no longer usable. And then they got rid of all the bridge patrols. So it was just a matter of time before the next time the bridge caught fire, it was going to go. And that happened in May of 1974. You know, I was working in IBM that day, and they passed the word over the PA system: don't try to go north on Route 9 through Poughkeepsie, because parts of the bridge are falling on Route 9. And I've seen pictures of the traffic being diverted through the center of Poughkeepsie to get around the problem. So after the bridge burned, there were all kinds of stories about, well, we're going to fix it right away, but nobody ever did. Conrail didn't want it, and nobody else had the money to fix it. So it sat there for 30 years. So what the effect was, the bridge stopped all that traffic that was going across there. And Hopewell Junction was no longer needed, because there were no longer any freight service going through there except local stuff. And a few local customers like Quinlan Gas and lumber companies and things like that weren't enough to justify the cost of maintaining the line from Poughkeepsie out to Hopewell. So in 1982, they decided that was the end of it. They so the last run with a diesel engine from Poughkeepsie out to Hopewell Junction. And in 1983, they tore up that section of track out to Hopewell Junction. And meanwhile, the county was interested in it. Dutchess County was thinking about building County Route 11, a north-south route to connect southern Dutchess with northern Dutchess. Well, they bought the right-of-way from Hopewell Junction up to Poughkeepsie. The county bought it. And the problem, I'm not sure exactly why, maybe it wasn't wide enough or whatever. It turns out that they never did build County Route 11. So the next thing they did was they changed it and made it a utility corridor. And that old right-of-way now from Poughkeepsie out to Hopewell Junction, they buried water lines under it, and now they're in the process of paving it over to make a hiking and bicycling trail. And parts of it have already been paved, and parts of it are going to be for horses, crushed stone for horses with extra big parking spaces for horse trailers and things. So what used to be the battleground for climbing the hills with these old L1 steam engines is now a hiking and bicycling trail. The section from Lake Walton Road to Hopewell Junction has been open since last year, and I've hiked that, and it gets daily use. There's somebody out there every day, women jogging along, pushing their baby carriages, and rollerbladers and bicyclers, and it's a regular thing. So it's basically a Dutchess County park. It's about 100 feet wide and 12 miles long. And have you people thought of any questions you want to talk about now? Or?
Yeah, I've come up with thanks for the history. You've given some great stuff that we haven't heard before.
Well, if I think of more, there'll be more pop up.
Here's a couple questions that struck me as I was listening to you. You spoke about Brown and his idea, for creating
the New York, Boston, and Montreal. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, back in 1873.
Mm-hmm.
Now I know that there was already some false starts on building the bridge. At that point.
Yes.
How was Brown coming to terms or dealing with the possibility that the big bridge might come up? Was that something that might have been perhaps going to be a detriment to his ultimate plans?
Well, he was optimistic enough to think that the barges could still supply enough, because in addition to the coal traffic across the bridge, he also had freight service like what would now be UPS or something like that, American Express kind of thing. And they had regular boat service, steamboat service up and down the Hudson River that also stopped at Dutchess Junction. So that was part of their plan for Dutchess Junction. But ultimately, there wasn't enough of that to justify a railroad. And then when the New Haven Railroad, named the CNE, Central New England Railroad, sponsored by and paid for by the New Haven Railroad, bought it out and closed it down. So it was a matter of economics. He was optimistic and thinking he could still stay in business. And then G. Hunter Brown was part of the same Brown family. This was part of the Brown banking family. So they had or at least millions of dollars in a big banking center in New York City. So and George Brown was the he was one of the boys of the family, and he wasn't in very good health, and he moved to Millbrook for his health. And there wasn't any railroad in Millbrook at that time, so this was about the time of the Civil War. And he says, well, gee, I'd like to be able to commute to the office in New York. So that's one of the reasons why the railroad was built from Millbrook, because George Brown lived there in Millbrook. And then later on, G. Hunter Brown, who was also part of the family, became president of the ND&C. In 1895, I think he took over as the younger Brown, and he was president of it until the time it was absorbed into the Central New England in 1904.
Is there any evidence that the Brown family perhaps resisted the idea of building the bridge?
Well, I'm not sure. I've never saw any evidence that they actually resisted it. They were just competing with it, basically, because they had a barge in service and a lot of coal coming across that river, and they were up and running way before the bridge was built. So they were in business and running, and thought that they could survive even if the bridge was built. And the main reason that the main financial and impetus behind building the bridge was the people of Poughkeepsie. And there was contention between Newburgh and Poughkeepsie at that point in time to be king of the freight service on the Hudson River, and Poughkeepsie won out.
You kind of just answered my next question. I was going to ask you to speak to why Poughkeepsie and Highland were selected.
I think part of the reason was because of the topography of the land. Okay, in Newburgh, it's fairly low, and they would have had to come down the hill to the river and up the hill on the other side. Now, in Poughkeepsie, there's a very convenient cliff on the west side, and Poughkeepsie is fairly high up on the east bank, so they just built a bridge across the top. So the old steam engines wouldn't have to go all the way down across a bridge and back up the other side.
In regards to the ferry service, about how many cars of the freight cars could actually be fit onto one of these ferries?
Well, the one I was talking about, the William T. Hart, that was at that time was the second largest ferry boat in the world, and it held 27 freight cars on each run. And it could also take passenger cars, but passenger cars were longer, so they couldn't take quite as many passenger cars.
And about how many cars would a train on waiting to go across? How many would it encompass?
It would depend on what time frame you're talking about. The early ones, when the engines weren't all that powerful, you might have 20, 25 cars on a train. But by the time the big bridge was in operation up into the 1970s, you had 100, 125 car freight trains a mile long. So depending on the time frame and how big a locomotive you had to pull it.
Great. In regards to Dutchess Junction, about how big was the town?
Well, there was, in addition to the railroad headquarters there was also some brickyards there. There were there's some big excavations in the hillside where they were getting the clay to make bricks. As a matter of fact, there were some interaction between them because the railroads hauled the bricks, and the brick companies owed the railroad money. And at one point in time, the roundhouse at Dutchess Junction, the railroad roundhouse, had a big steel smokestack, which, of course, steel corroded very quickly, and they had a problem with this. You know, it finally fell down in a storm. So they said, well, we got to build something a little more substantial. So they decided to build a brick chimney for it instead. And of course, the brickyard was right on the other side of the fence. And the brick company owed them money. So they said, well, okay, you can pay us off in bricks to build a new chimney for our roundhouse. So there was that kind of an operation, and there were tenement houses all up alongside of the hill for all the workers in the railroad, and for the brickyards, and for the ferry service. So it was a substantial little town. But if you go down there today, you know, the only thing you find down there is maybe a couple pieces of concrete foundation and some bricks. Everything's gone. The ferry docks are all gone, and there's nothing left there.
It kind of brings up another question I wanted to ask about Dutchess Junction. That is in terms of the workers themselves. And I know you read all of the handwritten accounts, and probably got a good sense of who these people were. Can you tell me what life might have been like for a worker on the railroads at Dutchess Junction?
Okay, well, the workers who actually worked on the track gangs, the people who lived in the tenements, and you know, the average guy who might have worked in the roundhouse or something, you know, he would work for relatively little amount of pay, almost nothing compared to what we know today. A guy who was a supervisor of these guys would make like $45 a month. And you know, of course, the track gang would make $25, $30 a month, maybe. And they were talking about a dollar. And one, like in the big snowstorm of 1888, the big blizzard of '88, the famous one. Well, it took them 17 days to clear the tracks from Hopewell up through to Millerton, and they hired outside help to do the shoveling. And in some cases, up like in Winchell Cut up by Millerton, they had to shovel the snow 6 levels up to get it out of the cut. So they had hundreds of guys working, and they hired them for $1 a day. And then they supplied them with a shovel and you know, and a pair of gloves and that sort of thing. But $1 a day was good wages in those days, you know. So a month, you know, if you work 6 days a week for a month, you know, you might work 24, 25 days at $1 a day. Some of the track gang guys who were experienced in putting track together and that sort of thing made $1.25 maybe a day. But then back at that point, you know, $1.25 would buy quite a bit. So that was a living wage back in those days. And you know, that was fairly common. And there were occasional strikes when you know, when the New York Central track gangs were paying 10 cents a day more than the ND&C. There were people who would leave, and then ND&C would jack up their price a little bit, you know, up their wages. So it was similar to what's happening today, just on a different monetary scale.
Is there any evidence of any worker unrest or perhaps worker violence that may have taken place?
Not on the ND&C. They were all fairly copacetic, except that when things got tight and the railroad didn't come through with the payroll on time, they would just quit and go away. So you know, that was. There's no records of any real violence. The only fatalities were occasional accidents. Back in those days, before there were such a thing as air brakes on a train. The way you stopped a train was cranking the hand wheels. And the locomotive would have brakes, okay, but here you had this big long line of freight cars back there, and there was a hand crank wheel on each of the freight cars. And there were trainmen, brakemen, who used to walk on the catwalks on top of the freight cars. And when they had to stop, they'd crank the brakes on this one, jump to the next car, and crank the brakes on that one. Now, that was a very dangerous job in the wintertime. There'd be ice on top of those cars. So there was quite a few fatalities and that sort of thing. And I don't know if you ever noticed in old pictures of old railroads, there would be a frame across the top of the railroad with a bunch of ropes hanging down. They called it a telltale. They would have one of those before you got to a tunnel or a bridge as a warning to these guys who were up on top of the freight cars. If he was up there cranking away on one of these hand wheels and he got slapped with a rope, he knows he better duck because he's going to go under a bridge. And if he didn't duck, that was the end of him. So that was not a very safe job, but you could make $1 a day doing that.
And that's where we get the term telltale sign, huh?
Something like that, I guess.
Sure.
Anyway.
Again, about these workers, were they transitional people? Were these career guys who'd stay fixed?
Most of them were career. They, when they, unless they decided that 10 cents a day more for the other railroad, they would still live in the same house and just work for the other railroad. The New York Central up along the Hudson River connected at Dutchess Junction with the ND&C. So it was fairly convenient, They just depending on which side of the tracks they walked to when they went to work in the mornings.
Okay.
How did the bridge affect Maybrook's economic development? Because I know.
Well, Maybrook didn't exist before the bridge. It became Orange Junction, where the railroads came together, and then they started to build a yard there, and the town grew up around it. So basically, Maybrook exists as a town because there was such a thing as a bridge. If that bridge hadn't been there, it probably never would have been a town of Maybrook.
And how was Maybrook affected after the bridge fire?
Well, the big yard in Maybrook employed at its peak somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 people. And now it's a truck terminal. So those 1,500 people had to go somewhere. When the fire happened, the work crews were down to a much smaller number than the 1,500, but they were basically out of business at that point. So economically, Maybrook was in pretty bad shape. But now, yellow freight, the big yellow freight trucks that you see on the highways, they have a big truck terminal on what used to be the Maybrook rail yard. There's one single track going through now, and all the rest of the tracks are gone.
The building of the bridge and I guess subsequent closing at Dutchess Junction, did that affect maybe the prices or even the amount of commodities that were coming in, specifically things like coal, milk, some of the issues that you addressed specifically in your book?
Well, obviously, the railroads hauled a lot of milk. That was one of the major products. Every little town seemed like had a creamery, for processing milk. Dutchess County was a big dairy processing outfit. Like, for example, Borden's built a rather large milk processing plant in Hopewell Junction. It opened in the spring of 1901, and that they had ice that they salvaged from the ponds. So the ice that was used at the one in Hopewell Junction came from a pond in Billings, and the railroad hauled the ice to Hopewell Junction, and they had 900 tons of ice, which they used to keep the milk cool. And the railroad had, all along its railroad's path, had stops where they would pick up these 10-gallon milk cans and haul them to the processing plants. Well, there was one in Hopewell Junction, there was one in LaGrange, and there was one in Millbrook, and every little town had a milk processing plant. And the one in Hopewell Junction had 6 railroad cars that were dedicated to hauling the milk from that plant to New York City. Well, they didn't go all the way to New York City, but they went down to connect to the New York Central Railroad. Okay, the new ND&C Railroad hauled them from Hopewell Junction down to Dutchess Junction, and then they would go from there down to the city with ice in the summertime. Of course, they had the opposite problem in the winter. When it was cold, the milk would freeze, and then they had to try to keep it warm to keep it from freezing. But there were something in the range of 500 cases of quart bottles in each freight car, and there were 6 of those cars that they were shuttled back and forth from Hopewell Junction to New York City just for that one plant. So it was a big operation. But then in the 1920s, when truck traffic became so much more prevalent, then you didn't have to build your creameries along a railroad anymore. And trucks could go from the farm to wherever the creamery was. And most of the railroad-built creameries were out of business. So the one in Hopewell Junction is long gone.
Could you speak to how weather affected railroads, and in particular the bridge? How did they maintain the bridge during times of snow, or during how did severe rains perhaps affect bridge traffic?
Well, rain wasn't such a big problem, except it made the rails slippery. Of course, on the locomotives, they had sanders to put sand on the rails so they get a little more traction in the rain. But weather was always a problem. I mentioned before the big blizzard of 1888. It took them 17 days to open up the line from Dutchess Junction to Millerton. And there were snow plows, big V-type snow plows they would put in front of a locomotive. And sometimes when snow was deep, they'd have 2 locomotives pushing a plow on the lines to blast the snow off to the sides. And the New York Central even had a big fancy new invention, which was a rotary type thing, which was a humongous snowblower that the New York Central used. But the ND&C couldn't afford one of those. They just had a regular V plow, and when it got too deep to where they couldn't push through it anymore, then they'd hire a bunch of guys to come out and start shoveling. And one of the things they would do was they had these open gondola cars, and they would shovel the snow into the gondola cars and ship it somewhere south, let it melt. Either that or if you had the only way to get it out of the gondola would be to shovel it out again. You didn't want to do that. So they just ship it somewhere south and let it melt.
People actually get up on the bridge shoveling snow?
Well, actually, the way the bridge is built, it didn't accumulate much snow because there were openings between these ties and rails. So it never accumulated very much on the bridge. Off the bridge, where it would pile up, particularly in the cuts. Up toward between Pine Plains and Millerton, there was a place called Winchell Mountain, where the cut was I don't know how many feet deep it was, but that particular cut was where they took all the shoveling time in the big blizzard of '88, and there was another case on the Harlem line, which wasn't part of the ND&C, but the Harlem line, where there was a cut that had drifted full of snow, and they tried to push through it with 3 locomotives and a plow. Well, when they hit it, the plow stopped and the 3 locomotives didn't. And a couple of guys were killed. The crew members were mangled and steam. And, big mess. So, that could be a problem. And the big blizzard of 1888, it was interesting. The day before the blizzard, it had been so dry that there were grass fires along the edges of the road. And when there was a grass fire in Fishkill that almost burned the old Van Wyck house in Fishkill. There were 6 grass fires in Fishkill the day before the blizzard.
Speaking of the blizzard, I believe the bridge was in its final stages of completion in that winter time. Have you heard anything about how the blizzard might have affected construction, or can you even speak to the construction of the bridge?
Well, the bridge was completed in late in 1888, and the blizzard was in March of '88. So it was like a few months before the bridge was completed. But the bridge was in fairly good, pretty much completed, almost completed at the time. And my understanding was that for those few days of the blizzard, they just stopped work. I don't know what else they could do, Yeah.
Can you speak to the construction of the bridge, just briefly?
Well, construction of the bridge, I think Carlton Maybe's book is what really explains it in great detail with a lot of pictures. And I contributed some to that book as well. But the planning on it had started back in the 1870s, early 1870s. And they had started work on it, and the original company that worked on it had some fatalities and a lot of problems, financial problems, and they finally gave up on it. And then a few years later, another company reformed, and started and finally finished the project. So there was a period of years in the middle where it was partly built and nothing was done. It kind of laid there. But there was enough of a financial incentive because of the problem of the river freezing over, how do you get coal across the river? People in Poughkeepsie says, wait a minute, we're getting cold over here. We need coal for our heaters. So there was enough of a financial incentive to complete the project. So another company started it up and finally finished it in 1888. The first train across was in December, the last day of December, 1888.
What part of the book did you contribute to? What part did you write or help or assist in?
I had already published the previous book on the ND&C, and Carlton had seen parts of it, and we had been to other meetings and things. And the part that I contributed was mainly in the sources of laborers that were used for the bridge. They would go down to the New York City on the streets of the tenement sections of New York City and recruit Italians who were right off the boat. And of course, so a lot of the construction workers on the bridge were actually from the tenement areas of Manhattan. And they'd bring them up here, and house them for a particular time, and they would work, for whatever time was. And I had already found that out because some of those Italian workers were used on the ND&C. They were immigrants who were looking for a job, and I contributed that piece of it to the bridge.
Didn't a lot of Italians work at the Maybrook switching yard?
Most of the people that I've met over there, it seems like a pretty significant fraction, a high fraction of the people in Maybrook were Italian. Tony Moreno, for example, Sam Cristiano. And a lot of the railroad workers were Italian, because I think mainly because the Italian families were coming across, immigrating to the United States at that period of time, and the railroads were looking for workers, and they were looking for jobs, and it was a natural fit, I guess.
Have you found much evidence of the Italians staying in the area after they arrived, after they started working?
Well, yeah. If you look at the names in the phone book in Maybrook, it seems like about half of them are Italian. Like Tony Morano, for example, he's still there. He's retired now, and he's a volunteer at the Maybrook Railroad Museum. You see him there every weekend.
When was the Maybrook Railroad Museum started?
When, well, I'm not sure when the museum was actually started, but I got the impression that it was when the big bridge burned, and some of these people who had worked for the railroad and the train traffic through town slowly was winding down to nothing. and they decided, well, we got to try to save some of this. So they started collecting some of this stuff, and some of the people who had worked there, and they talked the town people into letting them have a room in the Maybrook Library. So one room of the Maybrook Library is now the Maybrook Railroad Museum, and the people who operate it, volunteers, are almost all former Maybrook Railroad Yard employees or New Haven Railroad employees.
So its mission has been pretty much to preserve anything about Maybrook and the Poughkeepsie Railroad Bridge?
Well, their primary mission is the Maybrook Yard, but the yard itself is actually it exists because of the big bridge. Okay, so there's got to be there's a definite connection there. So there's a lot of pictures in the museum of the railroad bridge itself. So that's pretty much I don't know what you would call it, but they go together, Maybrook and the big bridge. Yeah.
Thanks for answering. Great. One question I have: I've heard that was a dramatic reduction in train traffic towards going into the 1960s, 1970s.
That's right.
Could you speak to that? What was the causes of this decline?
Well, okay. Most of the railroads in the Northeast were having that kind of problem. Okay. The biggest problem was the competition from highway trucks. So the total amount of freight that was moved by rail was decreasing, and also the railroads that were still surviving wanted to cut costs as much as possible. Now, when it got to the 1970s, when Conrail had the Maybrook Yard and the Poughkeepsie Bridge, they also had the Selkirk Yard and the big bridge in Albany. And there were several small railroads, the Erie and a couple of others, that connected to Maybrook. And they were not as necessarily the best connections for Western freight. So things were slowly winding down, but most of the traffic on Conrail was slowly migrating to Selkirk and the big bridge in Albany. So in the 1970s, early 1970s timeframe, Conrail didn't really want the big bridge here in Poughkeepsie. They wanted to, they owned the rails on the run up in Albany, but all the freight coming into Maybrook was coming in on competing railroads. So Conrail wanted to consolidate as much as possible their big freight line from Chicago to Albany. So Maybrook was competing with Albany's main freight service. So slowly they were working things around to the point where Maybrook was beginning to fade. And as I said before, they basically ignored the bridge in Poughkeepsie until it caught fire.
At the bridge's peak, about how many trains would go over a day?
Well, it depends on what time frame you're talking about. When during World War II, there was a lot of military traffic. So there were times when you would have a train across that bridge, every hour, 24 hours a day. But then toward the end, it was 2 or 3 trains a day. Toward the end, when it finally burned, there was only 2 or 3 trains a day at that point.
Could you talk a little about the Central New England Railway tours you give?
Central New England Railway was a consolidation of a bunch of smaller pieces that was formed in 1899. And it actually ran from Hartford, Connecticut, across Connecticut to the state line by Millerton and into New York State. And then the Rhinebeck in Connecticut ran from Millerton over to Rhinebeck and Rhinecliff. And there was the ND&C that ran down to Dutchess Junction, but there was also 2 other railroads from Pine Plains. There was the Poughkeepsie and Eastern, and the Poughkeepsie and Connecticut. What happened was that when the big bridge was built, their intent, the company that built the bridge, their intention was to buy the railroad from Poughkeepsie over to the state line in Millerton, which was the P&E. We had been in business since 1872 or so, and when they got to Poughkeepsie and finished the big bridge, the P&E decided they weren't going to sell. They wouldn't sell them the tracks. So the bridge company decided, well, we've got to get to Connecticut. So they built another line in parallel from Poughkeepsie to Pine Plains. That was the P&C. So those two lines were competing from Poughkeepsie up to Pine Plains, and they crossed in a couple of places, in Salt Point and farther north. And they ran within a few feet of each other into Pine Plains. And those railroads all belonged to the Central New England, because the New Haven Railroad was the money behind the Central New England. And they bought up all of these little small railroads. So that by the time they bought it all up, all the north-south railroads in Dutchess County along the Hudson River and the Harlem line were New York Central. But everything that ran east and west across the other way all belonged to the Central New England or the New Haven. So by the time they consolidated everything, there were only two railroads in Dutchess County.
A final question from me. Could you speak to some of the lighter anecdotes and funny stories
Okay.
you've come across?
Yeah, well, there's quite a few of those. For example, in the ND&C books, one of the things I ran across was a shipment of bottles of beer that landed in Hopewell Junction, and they looked in there, and the bottles were half empty, and the corks were put back in the bottles. And as far as I know, they never figured out what happened to that, but it's a pretty good guess what happened there. And they had a problem with pilfering, so there was a notice pulled out that any cases or cartons that had shoes in them, pairs of shoes, had to be double banded so nobody could steal the shoes out of them. And local farmers would complain about the railroad crews would stop along the line and steal their apples or their produce, that kind of thing. And one particular one I remember, in Fishkill, there was a shipment of a rather large bag of smoked meat that landed at the station in Fishkill to be delivered to Matawan. And the station agent just took one sniff and says, he didn't want that bag of meat in his shop because it was in July and it was getting pretty ripe. So he put it on the next train going down to Matawan. Well, they got to the station in Matawan, and the guy down there, he didn't want it any more than the other guy did. So they said, well, we got to get rid of this bag of meat. So they got a local delivery guy with a horse and a wagon. And this was in 1896. And in July, hot weather, they put this bag of meat in the back of the wagon, and I can just see this guy with a clothespin on his nose, clip-clopping down Main Street in Beacon, which is now Beacon, and he was going to the butcher shop where this meat was supposed to go. Well, he gets to the butcher shop, and the butcher says, I'm not going to let that bag of meat in my shop, not the way that smells. The Board of Health will close me down. So here's this guy sitting out there with his smelly bag of meat in the back of his wagon trying to figure out what to do. So he gets his bright idea. He just goes the rest of the way down Main Street, and he dumped the bag off at a lard rendering plant down there and drove off. Well, in the record books of the railroad now we're starting to get letters. The meat company says, where's the money for the meat? The railroad says, hey, who's going to pay for the shipping here? Okay. And the butcher saying, wait a minute, I didn't get my order of meat, and they never did find the guy with the wagon. So that was the end of the story. This guy just went off into the weeds and disappeared, and they never saw him again. So that kind of things, that was fairly common, and they always had problems with, the wrong kind of words written on the outhouse wall, sort of thing, on the insides of the wall. That was common back in those days too. And they had gum vending machines in their stations, and people were forever breaking into the gum vending machines and taking the coins out of them. The times haven't changed all that much. It's just the technology was a little different. There was a guy named Ed Ross, lived in Hopewell Junction, who who did a bunch of cartoons about railroads. He was a good artist, and he had one picture of the railroad train stopped, freight train stopped, and the crew in the creek, swimming in the creek. And he said, you can always tell when it's spring when the train is late because the crew's in this creek swimming, that type of thing. So in one case down at Dutchess Junction, there was this businessman in his fence in a nice suit and everything, sitting on a bench waiting for his train to go to Millbrook. And there were a couple of the local railroad guys from the ND&C who were just horsing around, and it had rained, I guess, and they were throwing mud at each other, and a big splatter of mud got on this guy, all over this guy's suit, and he's put in a bill to the company, and then the two guys who were horsing around got fired, of course, and they had to pay for the guy's suit, that sort of thing. It's fairly common. You find these things scattered all through the books. So, life wasn't that much different in those days. It just, the technology was a little different. That's about it. But people were the same.
Great. What do you find the most interesting about the Poughkeepsie Railroad Bridge?
Poughkeepsie, and the view from up on top. I've been up there like 3 or 4 times. And you walk out on that bridge and you look north, you can see Hyde Park. You look south, you can see way down to Danskammer Point. And on a beautiful day, and these huge, humongous ships are sailing under you. That's the best thing. It's really a tremendous view from up there. If when the next year when they get that thing up there, I'm going to be one of the first ones up there to walk across it again. I've got some pictures I've taken from the couple times I've been up there, and it's beautiful views from up there. But the way they've had it up previously is the walkway out there is a metal grill work that you can see through. And I've got one picture that I've taken of looking straight down. You can see the toes of my shoes looking through the grill work in the river 200 feet down below. So, but it's a spectacular walk, mainly.
Do you think once the bridge is open, there'll be a better appreciation for the bridge? Everything that went into it, the construction?
Well, it depends on whether the people who walk on the bridge actually understand it. If the history of the bridge, or the is available to these people, like for example, plaques on the bridge or something like that, to explain it, or photographs or pictures or whatever. If there's a book available on like Carlin's book maybe, or how many other books may be written about the bridge, that would be If people understand the bridge, then I'm sure there's going to be a lot more appreciation for it.
And do you think the effect, once the walkway is open, do you think it'll be positive, negative to the Hudson Valley?
I think it'll be a big tourist draw because I'm one of the organizers of the Central New England Railway Historical Tours we do every year, and we have 100 to 110 people on 2 buses, and these people come from all over the place, from California, North Carolina, Florida. One fellow even flies in from Germany every year just to go on these tours of the. And this past April, the tour started with a walk on that bridge. This was, the high point, and people really raving about what the view is from up on that bridge. So I can understand where it's going to be a big tourist draw once the word gets out.
I had talked to you about yesterday about this one person who's also like in the process of writing a book about.
Oh yeah, there's another fellow I know, Pete Brill. He's working on a book that basically is documentation of all the connecting railroad lines that came into the Maybrook Yard from the west, to Erie and all those lines over that way. and their connections to the big bridge. Now, I've reviewed his manuscript, and he's slowly adding and working to it. And he's at the point now where he's negotiating with a publisher to get it published. So that book may be out in the next year or two.
And then you also helped with the publication of the Maybrook switching terminal that you had.
Oh yeah, Mark Newman's book. Yes, Mark Newman's book on the Maybrook Yard was being done by the Purple Mountain Press, and my previous books have been published by Purple Mountain. So Ray, who was the publisher, called me up and said, "Would you like to take a look at this manuscript and see what you can do?" So he sent me a copy of Mark Newman's manuscript, and I went through it and made quite a few corrections because from a railroad point of view. Mark Newman is a history professor, and I was looking at it from the railroad point of view and doing technical corrections on railroad type stuff. It was on a tight schedule, so I didn't have time to do all that much with it. I would think that it could stand to be redone in a second volume and updated, but it's a lot of good pictures. You had excellent pictures in there, a lot of good pictures of what happened in the railroad yard, the tools that were used by the railroaders, and the pictures of the buildings that used to be there and that type of thing. So it's a good book from that point of view, but since he was into it more from the history aspect, I tried to inject some of the railroad into it, and it could still use some more work. But
I was going to ask these questions a little bit earlier, but just to find a little bit about you, how long have you actually been in the Hudson River Valley?
I moved here in 1964, so I've been here 44 years. That's my IBM job. I worked for IBM in New Jersey. In Atlantic City, there were the air traffic control system in Atlantic City was developed by the FAA air traffic control, and it's the computer system that's now installed in airports all over the country. And then when that was winding down, I transferred to Poughkeepsie, and I wrote instruction manuals to teach the field engineering guys how to troubleshoot and repair mainframe computers. I did that for a number of years, and I've retired from IBM engineering in 1991. So for the last 16, coming up on 17 years, I've been free to pursue my interest in railroads.
So where were you born and raised?
Actually, my family is from a Swedish background. I'm first generation on this side of the river, on this side of the Atlantic. My great-grandfather worked for the Swedish railroads, and he was the station master in a little town called Polcirkeln, which is where the railroad tracks cross the Arctic Circle in the northern part of Sweden and Lapland. At one time, he was the conductor on the line that runs north up through the iron mining district to Narvik, Norway. And then my grandfather, his son, my grandfather, was foreman of the railroad station in a town called Boden. He died in 1922, and my grandmother brought the family over to the United States. And a few years later, I came along. I was actually born in New Jersey. So I grew up in a Swedish family. I had to learn English in a hurry when I started school, because the whole family all spoke Swedish. And when I started school, the teacher was Italian. She didn't know what I was talking about. So I had to sort out the words, and by the time I got through first grade, I was fairly proficient in English.
What school did you go to in New Jersey?
Well, it was called Sharp School, the grade school, first school. And then we moved to another farm farther south in Franklinville. And then I went to high school down there. And from high school, I went into Navy electronics. By the time I finished high school, I was repairing radios and TV sets as a sideline. And so I got into Navy electronics and went through ET schools and spent my 4 years of Navy time. I spent 4 years in the Navy and never set foot on a ship. I got to fly every place I had to go, mostly out in California and across the Pacific Islands. But my job code was the ground end of aircraft communications. So that, I would fly from air station to air station, exotic places like Kwajalein, and I spent a year and a half on Guam, to Japan and Hawaii and that type. I spent a year and a half in California, in the desert in California. It was a strange place for a Navy base out in the desert, 49 feet below sea level. But it was a training base, but that was my background. And that education in electronics was what got me into IBM engineering.
So what interests you the most about the Hudson Valley?
Hudson Valley? Well, from the first place, it's a beautiful spot. Okay, there's a lot of nice scenery around here, and and my job was here, so I could commute back and forth to work with no problem at all. And in an hour, I could be in the Catskills, or again go to Connecticut or south to New York City if you needed to go to a show or something. It's kind of a central location where you can do most of the things you want to do. My son brags about being in California. So from where he lives, he can go up to skiing on the mountains or out to the beach on the same day. Similar to that here, but it's not quite as much difference in altitude here. But there's a lot of things to do around here. Rhinebeck Aerodrome. There's a lot of railroad history around the area. I was particularly interested in railroad history, so that's how I really got into it.
And that's how you ended up coming across the Poughkeepsie Railroad Bridge?
Well, yeah, because I started out. I'm president of a group that's trying to restore the Hopewell Junction depot. And Hopewell Junction was the base for a number of locomotives. The climb up the hill going eastbound toward Danbury was a pretty steep climb for the old steam engines. So they would come across the big bridge in Poughkeepsie, go out to Hopewell Junction, and they would stop there. They would put another engine on the back called a pusher and give them a boost, and they would push them up over the hill to Danbury. Well, they wouldn't go all the way to Danbury. The pusher would go up as far, just up to the top of the mountain past Poquag, and then the pusher would drop off and come back to Hopewell and wait for the next eastbound freight train. So those locomotives were based and serviced in the yard in Hopewell Junction. So that was the main reason for Hopewell Junction, and I happened, when I moved up here, that's where we bought a house, and I said, this is interesting. So, and we're still actively working to rebuild that train station. It's on the old Maybrook line right-of-way, which the county bought. And it has been designated as the trailhead for the Hopewell end of the county rail trail. So we're slowly rebuilding it to the point where we can try to make a small museum and educational facility out of it, for the rail trail, for the town of East Fishkill.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Can't think of much of anything else. You got any more questions you want to throw at me?
I think I think I'm certainly good.
If you want to branch out into some of the other parts of the railroads around the county, I can always come back for another session sometime.
Sure.
But I know you're concentrating on the bridge at this point.
As we start seeing how our information is laid out, that we may very well contact you for a few follow-ups.
Okay. And I'll leave these pictures with you
Great.
so that you can use them for whatever you'd like.
Great.
Thank you
Okay.
very much.